Yes, I do have a research interest in and around social policy, youth offending, modern slavery, and child sex trafficking. I have a sort of a strange sort of route into academia. I was in the army originally for 6 years, and then I left the army, and then I went to work in with young people in children's home settings. I actually am a director of a series of children's homes up in the northwest, up in Liverpool. You can probably see my Liverpool flag in the background, and I'm a Liverpool season ticket holder. So, yes, it's been a sort of a journey into this. One of the reasons why I chose to do a PhD on social workers' understanding of child sex trafficking is because I was actively involved in a case of child sex trafficking in Liverpool, and I firsthand witnessed the gaps and the deficiencies that allowed this young person to actually be trafficked. And so that was my journey into academia. And now obviously I'm based at ARU teaching criminology and policing studies. But today's outline is quite a bit to get through, and I will introduce what child sex trafficking is. And the learning outcomes today, hopefully you will understand what CST is which I call it. So child sex trafficking, I will explain why it's still occurring. I will talk a little bit about the indicators and who is vulnerable to child sex trafficking. So what is child sex trafficking? Well, it's a form of modern slavery. We talk about slavery being abolished, normally in the terms of transatlantic slavery, but slavery was never abolished. It was only outlawed. It does involve the sort of, not the old type of slavery where transatlantic slavery was trade between people, where it was legal to actually sell and buy another person. Now it's done through threats of coercion, violence, and manipulation. So slavery has evolved into what it is today. Like I said, it is a form of human trafficking, and child sex trafficking is indeed slavery. It is indeed a form of human trafficking, but there are many aspects of human trafficking. It includes child trafficking. It could involve in labour. But my research aims are more to do with the sexual elements of this and why this is still occurring. And this sort of gives you a sort of a breakdown of sex trafficking, and elements of this sort of diagram here involves children, victims, profit in some ways. There are two elements of child sex trafficking. There is the big organised crime element of this, such as trafficking children into the UK for business, for profit and gain. But some of the child sex trafficking that we've witnessed in the UK over the last 10 years has been more or less a system of networks, people that know each other, sometimes family members. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen this TV programme, but Three Girls, which portrayed the actual Rochdale grooming. And so sort of taking us back a little bit, Rotherham was probably the first case, perhaps, of child sex trafficking in the UK. However, child sex trafficking first appeared as a matter of concern in 2012 when a gang of men in Rochdale became the first in the UK to ever be convicted of child sex trafficking. There's been numerous documentaries on this, numerous reports, inquiries, and like I said, it's now been serialized into a TV show, and the TV show only sort of scratched the surface of this. It's called Three Girls, three of the girls who were actually caught up in Rochdale. However, we do not know the number of victims in Rochdale, and quite possibly over 3 decades, we're talking of hundreds of thousands of victims. So child sex trafficking has 6 phases, and part of the first phase is the recruitment process, how these young people are groomed. Sometimes they are groomed by people who they think they are friends. Sometimes the perpetrators who have groomed other young people use these young people to groom others. And then the next element here is obviously the travel, the transport, the movement. And we'll talk a little bit about the movement later on, and what type of movement actually is a form of trafficking. Then we have the arrival, and the arrival is sort of interlinked next to the exploitation, the actual crime taking place. In many cases, children do escape from this eventually. Many young people do not believe they're a victim of this crime until it's too late, or they escape, and then they're rehabilitated. And the problem is, though, this sort of repeats itself. There are many victims of child sex trafficking that end up being exploited again and again, and we've seen this in Rochdale. Some of the girls in Rochdale nearly broke free, and because of the lack of support from the local authorities and the social workers and the police officers, they continued to be trafficked for years to come. And one of the cases in Rochdale, there's a girl who the media have named Susie, and this girl basically she smashed the takeaway window. This was this takeaway where the exploitation was taking place up in the flat above it. She then went to the police and reported what had happened to her, that she'd been raped by 3 separate men, and this had been occurring over a period of time. The police ended up not pressing charges against these men, even when there was evidence, and I'm talking forensic evidence as well, enough information to actually prosecute these men at the time. This is what one of the independent inquiries has actually highlighted, is that this was one of the first occasions when they could have stepped in. However, what they decided to do with this girl instead was treat her like a perpetrator and charged her with criminal damage and cautioned her. So this is what sort of takes me to this sort of journey here, is why we need to do research around this, and why we need to have a look at the gaps. And it's the process of these 6 phases here that continue to happen, and it doesn't happen once to these young people. It happens over and over again in some occasions. So we do have then 3 elements of child sex trafficking, and these 3 elements are the target, the test, and the trap. And this is what the perpetrators actually they tend to use these 3 elements to trap young people. And the first part is this target. This is when the perpetrators, they observe children, they start manipulating them and recruiting them. They start marking them out for someone to watch. They're looking at their vulnerabilities. Like I said, they're observing them. They sort of know the traits that these young people who they can traffic. They sort of discover the children's vulnerabilities, and this is the element where they start gaining and developing trust. And then the test element here is that any perpetrator who exploits any children, they have to test out children's loyalty, because if a child speaks out, they will get caught. And this is when they start manipulating these children. They know these children are not willing, they're sort of willing victims in many sort of ways. They start introducing them to some more established members, sometimes their peers, girls who have already been exploited and trafficked. Sometimes this gives children a sense of belonging to these gang elements here. These men originally, they offer them gifts, they offer some form of support in and around this, and it creates some form of dependency. This is when they start asking for favours. Can you sleep with my friends? Driving them around in Manchester or other cities that this has occurred in, and passing them on to their friends, so that their friends can have sex with them. Sometimes money is exchanged, sometimes not, and it's normally favours between friends and family, or, like I said, a system of networks, men that know each other. And yes, there are females involved in this. There was someone in Rochdale who had been exploited by this gang for about 5 or 6 years. She ended up helping the men recruit more victims. So this girl was given immunity from prosecution during the trial, and there's the question, isn't it, is when a victim becomes a perpetrator. But this is what happens, and this is, it's a sorry case, is that these children who get caught up in this, they become adults and then exploit children themselves. And the trapping element of this is one when children feel trapped. They experience physical, psychological, and sexual violence. They're humiliated. They're controlled. They they felt like they're in some form of debt that from the gifts that they have received that they have to pay back. They get isolated from family, friends, sometimes isolated from society. This sort of dependency is reinforced. They're blackmailed, and and children who feel shame, they don't know where to turn to and who to turn to, and once they're alienated from their peers, from their family, it's very hard to get back, and this occurs, and it's part of these elements that we have to sort of understand this trapping, this dependency that these men actually put on to these children. So what technically is child sex trafficking? Well, it's a process of trapping children and young people through the use of violence, deception, coercion, and exploiting them for financial or personal gain. Children and young people are groomed and forced into acts of sexual exploitation. They do not have to be transported across international borders for sex trafficking to take place. This is a common perception. My research with social workers, many of them believe that that victims of child sex trafficking actually they actually originate from the continent, from Europe, and it might well be the case in some elements, but not always. And in fact, transporting or moving a victim over a certain distance doesn't even define trafficking, as it can take place within a single country or even within a single community. Someone can be trafficked in the same village, town, or city. So how do we define this? Well, the Modern Slavery Act, it defines child sex trafficking. Well, technically, child sex trafficking, it defines human trafficking as a form of modern slavery, and is when a person commits an offence if a person arranges or facilitates the travel of another young person with the view of exploiting that person. And what the Modern Slavery Act does, it pulls existing laws from the Children's Act and from the Sexual Offence Act. The Sexual Offence Act has now been updated and to include human trafficking and sex trafficking. However, this has only been updated. Section 58 in the Sexual Offence Act? It was only updated in 2013. The Modern Slavery Act was published in 2015. And when these crimes were being committed way before then, I can go back and I know I can establish cases of child sex trafficking from the 80s in Manchester. So it's literally these new laws and new provisions are very I would say very welcoming, but they are very late. Strangely enough, the MP and the Home Secretary who actually initiated the Modern Slavery Act was Theresa May, a former Prime Minister. So Theresa May, as much as she's done some really fantastic things while she's been in office, she's also she was also the Home Secretary that presided over the Windrush generation scandal. And I won't go off on topic on that. So if you have any interest around that, have a look at what the mistakes Theresa May regarding the Windrush generation. But coming back to the Modern Slavery Act, Theresa May lobbied this for a very long time, and she was able to get this put through Parliament and a statutory law, which is a step in the right direction. So we need to simplify the definition of child sex trafficking. We do not have a recognised definition of child sex trafficking, by the way. Yes, I was using the Modern Slavery Act and I was using the human trafficking definition, but still we do not have any form of definition. The police do not have a definition of child sex trafficking, neither do social services. And this is one of the problems that we have, is that social services do not know, they do not understand. There's a lack of understanding of child sex trafficking. And you're probably wondering if social workers are struggling with the definition of how to define and recognise and understand child sex trafficking, how can we actually improve and progress? which also means that young people are going to fall through the net and fall through the gaps, and they're going to be exploited and trafficked. But academics, Brayley and Cobain, they've done some extensive work around this, and they've actually tied together to simplify this definition that it is a repeated process involving two or more adults in which a child is recruited and transferred to a location in order to be sexually exploited. And that is a step in the right direction. It just takes time for governments and local authorities to establish policy around this, but still on. I mean, 10 years on from the Rochdale case, we still don't have a definition for this. We actually treat it, social workers, in my research, it's indicated that social workers actually see it through the lenses of child sexual exploitation. But the problem around that is that child sexual exploitation might be similar to child sex trafficking, but they are different, and they are different in nature and in a lot of ways. They may have some similarities, but they are so different. And also as well, one of the elements of trafficking is the movement, and that is perhaps easier to prosecute in a court of law than the actual exploitation itself. So because social workers do not understand and police officers do not understand the child sex trafficking elements of it, it means young people are trafficked for longer, and it means young people will fall through that gap, like I said. So for my research, I had to come up with some inclusion and exclusion criteria, and how can I figure out how many victims of child sex trafficking are there, and how long this has been occurring? Because if social workers and the police and the CPS are prosecuting this as sexual exploitation, then I mean, how are we meant to quantify how many victims are there? And so what I decided to do was revise old cases and have a look at some court transcripts, what was reported in the media, what was reported in the Home Office, and at the time of these convictions. You know, what was on the court transcripts? Was there movement? Was it sexual exploitation, or was it trafficking? So quite painstakingly, what I decided to do was come up with some inclusion and exclusion criteria. What was sexual exploitation and what was trafficking? So I had to do some work around how we define the victims, who are the actual offenders, what form of transportation would be involved in this, and the abuse pattern. So victims, easily enough, we can define the victims as a child aged 17 years of age or younger. And this is because it meets the national and international definition of a child. And so if we're calling something child sexual exploitation or child sex trafficking, we have to then use the definitions of what a child is. So it's quite a simple way to actually include this. So the offenders, what I had to do here, and it was quite painstaking to actually try and form some form of definition around this. So the offenders, I believe that they, in the end, I come out with that they were adults aged 18 years of older. I wanted to exclude peer-on-peer offending to ensure consistency with the UK definition of organised crime. Yes, children, I suppose, can traffic other children. There is evidence that this has actually occurred in the UK. However, I wanted to sort of exclude peer-on-peer offending. Also, as well, it is two or more offenders. Trafficking involves the trade between at least two people. There has to be one person who is sort of selling and the other one buying, and that is what sort of constitutes, and that's how I include offenders in this. So transportation, I mean, it can be any mode of transport. I mean, no minimum distance. It's deliberate movement in which the abuse can occur, and it can be defined as a movement to a location where sexual abuse will take place. And like I said, there's different elements of child sex trafficking. You have the international element of this, where people are flew from one side of the world to the other to be exploited for sex. Sometimes it can just be walking people to the next destination. It involves trains, all forms of transport. And this is where we have to sort of get away from this international sort of phenomenon from this. and the abuse pattern. At least one victim must be abused more than once for it to constitute form of trafficking. That would just be exploitation, sexual exploitation. And we have to distinguish internal child sex trafficking from other forms of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. I mean, so it's this repeated process of what makes it actually different to, as I said, sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. And like I said, most cases of child sex trafficking are seen as child sexual exploitation, and my research is trying to sort of change this. I've been actually delivering a workshop to social workers today in and around this. I've built up quite a significant database of social workers and different local authorities that I now do some work with. And it's a case of share the information and the research that as researchers actually conduct is about how we actually get our research out there and network and share this. So let's discuss some of the indicators, and this is where some of the social workers, I can understand why there's a conflation of child sex trafficking and child sexual exploitation, because the indicators are similar. We have physical and psychological indicators, mental health and psychological indicators, situational and environmental indicators, and societal. So in these different elements, and when I talk about societal indicators, in certain areas of the country, some of the most deprived areas, a young person is more likely to be at risk of child sexual exploitation or trafficking. Situation environmental indicators, if there's an issue in the family home or an issue with peers and friends, if children are hanging around in certain gang elements or hanging around on offer licenses, outside offer licenses, and as I said, problems in the family home, these children have a higher risk of exploitation for all forms of different exploitation. And this is why social workers tend to sort of put the exploitation all under one umbrella and come up with other forms of exploitation rather than child sex trafficking. Then physical and psychological, some children will have physical bruises and psychological issues in and around where, and also as well, young people don't tend to actually speak about this because they're ashamed of what's happening. They don't want to reach out, and the ones that do are very brave. And unfortunately, when certain teenage girls reached out in Rochdale and other cities like Rotherham, they were ignored. The attitudes towards them was that they're old enough to actually know what they were getting themselves into. That they and this is sort of a complication around the age of consent. When someone turns 16 and they consent to sex, social workers and even police officers in the CPS struggle around this because it becomes one of those cases where it's their word against the perpetrators. And then obviously there's mental health and psychological indicators that come with this. Children who are exposed to this form of exploitation will display those sort of indicators. So who is more vulnerable? Like I said, children who are at risk of significant harm. And significant harm can have a long-term effect on a child's behaviour, development and well-being. It can also impact significantly on a child's self-esteem, self-image and on the perception of themselves and others. Significant harm, this comes from the Children's Act, which social workers use to actually indicate if a young person is at risk. Child protection conferences are actually initiated from these 4 points, and there will be a protection conference will be convened if a social worker believes that one of these 4 points is actually occurring. But there's an issue with this, with significant harm. And this is another sort of gap in provision. Significant harm only actually works is if it's happening in the family home. So if significant harm is actually occurring in the community, so if a young person is not at risk in the family home or is at risk in the community, the social workers and police deal with it in different ways. So the whole instrument of child protection is that a child who is at risk in the community of significant harm will never find themselves on a protection register, where a young person who is at risk in the family home will. And child sex trafficking, generally, well, it happens in the community, not in the family home. And so that is another sort of gap in and around how we actually tackle child sex trafficking. We need an update here. We need to actually look at what we can do with young people in the actual community. If these child protection conferences can't be convened with the dangers in the community, then I mean, there's a lot of young people there that are going to go amiss. And then other elements here, like this, what makes children victims more vulnerable to exploitation and other children. And then this, you can sort of perhaps use this on any forms of exploitation. So poverty is a key indicator here. People who live in deprived communities, children who go missing from home, risk of significant harm in the family, children who are excluded from school. Learning difficulties is another element of this. So these children who sort of, if there's indications that they are suffering from these 5 elements, then they're more likely to be trafficked for sex or exploited for other means, let's say county lines or other forms of child exploitation. I mean, these effects extend into adult life, and this is one of the things that I look at when I look at policies that the governments and the local authorities form. I talk about prevention, how we should be investing into young people, how we should the more we invest into young people and they get through to adulthood with that stability, there's a better chance they will enter adulthood in a more positive frame. So children who are exploited in any form of way, they end up forming I don't know, negative relationships. They end up probably mixing with young people who have similar problems, and this is one of the issues in and around this. If it's not detected early on, then things spiral out of control. And in some situations, it can affect their parenting ability later on, and it can lead to more. Them maybe becoming someone who exploits children themselves. And I'm not saying that all people who are exploited will display this, but statistics tell us that young people who have a problematic lifestyle or have been exploited at some form in their childhood could have a problematic adulthood, and it just leaves them open to further abuse from sex traffickers and other perpetrators of other crimes. So, I mean, I've obviously criticised social services in the police as I started this, but what are the local authorities doing to tackle this? You know, there's been significant progress in implementing laws, and child protection services and local safeguarding boards have implemented policies around CSE, but not child sex trafficking. And like I said, there's child sexual exploitation and child exploitation training, but nothing around trafficking. And yes, I will speak to people who do training at the local authorities, and they say yes, child exploitation covers everything. But I've been on them training courses, and they do nothing around child sex trafficking. The social workers that I interviewed for my PhD, um, their knowledge was very minimal. And some of the workshops that I've done, the feedback that I've had is that they've actually been exposed to a new subject. So these are and it's not the child protection practitioners. It's not their fault. They're not to blame here. It's the local authorities and central government. They're the ones that should be designing these policies and training, so we can protect young people more effectively. So it's not the practitioners. The practitioners, most of them that I've come in contact with, they're hardworking, and they actually do this job because they care about young people. So it's the case of these practitioners need the tools to actually do their job effectively. So it's still difficult to guarantee safe outcomes for children and young people when it comes to child sex trafficking, notwithstanding the abundance of positive work of the practitioners involved with them. But I need to get my statistics from somewhere, right? If I'm banging on about this, I need to actually quantify this in a way. What we do have is something called the National Referral Mechanism, which is a process by which potential victims of human trafficking and modern slavery are identified and supported ahead of the decision being made whether or not they are indeed victims or not. And when I say victims or not, one of the elements of the NRM was there was cannabis farms in the late 90s, and when the police would go in, they would arrest children in these cannabis farms, and I know this is going off subject a little bit, but I'll just give you some context of what the National Referral Mechanism is. So they'd arrest these children, and what these children were, they were actually victims of slavery. These children would be arrested, prosecuted, sent to prison, and then when they served their sentence, they were then deported back to the country that they were from, and then they'd be re-trafficked back into the system. We do have a case of one young person who was re-trafficked 3 times, who had gone, the social workers and the police officers who were involved in this clearly never used the National Referral Mechanism. And this National Referral Mechanism as well, according to the Modern Slavery Act, it is an offence for any frontline worker, such as a social worker or a police officer, if they do not initiate the National Referral Mechanism at the first point of contact of a potential victim of modern slavery, then they could be prosecuted themselves under the same provisions. So, but when I asked, I've now asked over 500 social workers officially how many of them know what the NRM is, and only sort of around about 2% could actually tell me what the National Referral Mechanism was. And so if our social workers don't even actually know, or police officers know what the National Referral Mechanism is, then how are they actually meant to use it? And again, that is not their fault. This problem lies with the local authorities and central government. So child sex trafficking is at a record high. I mean, the statistics actually indicate a 530% rise in the last 7 years. I'm waiting for the new statistics to be published. In 2020, the statistics plateaued a little bit, but we were all in lockdown. There was obviously COVID was at its high point then, and if you think about it as well, these are the ones that have been reported via the NRM, not the ones that we don't know of. What I'm expecting when the new statistics are published in the coming weeks is that we will probably see an explosion, and it will probably rocket quite significantly because of the plateau that we've seen in 2020. So now child sex trafficking has gone beyond the confines of academic and policy research to become a topic of public concern. But I mean, it's not really. I mean, we don't really see much in the news about this anymore, and it's something now that sort of, I believe, that's been sort of swept under the carpet to an extent. County lines is now the sort of the in thing, and is what a lot of researchers are now looking at. Social workers are actually they're more aware of actually county lines than they are of child sex trafficking. The new serious violence strategy that was published by the government is all about county lines, not a mention of child sex trafficking, and then the recent actual government Home Office sort of review hardly even gives this a mention of when we're talking about crimes committed against children, and this is the fastest growing form of slavery in the UK. So, I mean, and you can put this in the actual chat box. I did have something on Poll Everywhere, but my Poll Everywhere is not working. But I'll give you a minute or so. How many cities and towns in the UK do you think have had cases of child sex trafficking in the last 10 years? And I'll give you a moment to actually think of it. You just a figure. If you don't know, have a guess. And but it'd be interesting to sort of, if anyone who's listening, how many cities and towns have been affected by this. Do you want me to continue, or is anyone going to have a guess, or does anyone want to guess? But I can continue on. I know we are sort of strapped for time, so I have to sort of be careful.
We do have a couple of responses coming through, Paul,
Yeah.
in the chat. So we've got Megan has put for her class unrecorded, all of them.
Yeah.
Callie has put my students guess that it's pretty much all of them.
Mm.
And we have another individual typing as well, all of them again. Yeah.
Do you know, I would actually agree. I'm not saying those answers are wrong, but definitely when I spoke to someone in Cambridge County Council, and they said to me, well, child sex trafficking's never occurred in Cambridge. And I said, just because we haven't detected it doesn't mean it's not happened, right? And that's some of the when you talk to some of the local authorities, and you're trying to convince them that they need this form of training, it's convincing them to actually invest in something that hasn't happened yet. And I actually believe it is affected, but these are the cases that I've actually found. So as I said, it's at a record high. I've actually uncovered in my research 43 comparable cases to Rochdale throughout the UK. So anyone who knows that Three Girls TV show, or the sort of elements of what happened in Rochdale. And remember, Rochdale was that landmark case of the very first conviction of child sex trafficking in the UK. And if I try and find this information is not readily available, I have to go through court transcripts, sometimes local media, freedom of information requests via the Home Office and the National Crime Agency, and getting information from them is really tough. And this database that I've built, there's certainly a lot more. And I actually agree with what some of the students said then. It is happening everywhere. I will continue to work on this database as I feel it's still incomplete. But this is the map that we've actually built an interactive map around this now, where you can click on it and it tells you the convictions and the dates of them. So we can see and you know, I'm not sure where everyone is actually from who's participating in this today, but Peterborough, this has happened on Cambridgeshire's doorstep. It happens in places like Oxford, some of the most wealthiest cities in the UK, but there is a concentration in the northwest, where I'm from, mainly around Greater Manchester, and this all the way up to Glasgow in Scotland. And it's literally something that is occurring in every single area of the UK, and what can we actually do to actually prevent this? And we can do things. And it is about sharing information. It's about training social workers and police officers and developing new policies around this. It's the only way we can actually prevention is always the best thing. Unfortunately, in our society, and which we don't think a problem is a problem until it is an actual problem. And that's when social work is more reactive to something happening than when it's not happening. They feel it's not a problem occurring. There was a journalist called Norfolk who wrote for the Times. He was writing about this for 2 decades, and at one point the Labour Council up in Rochdale accused him of his articles of being politically motivated. When the Rochdale case was heard in court, 2 Labour councillors, and I don't want to make this political. By the way, I'm a member of the Labour Party, so I mean it sounds like I'm attacking the Labour Party here, but I'm not. I'm just trying to make the point of what happens when court cases actually go to court. 2 Labour councillors in Rochdale gave the perpetrators, who were convicted of child sex trafficking crimes, gave the perpetrators character references. Those councillors are still in position today, and that's the problem that we have, is because they were denying that this was actually occurring on their doorstep. And if you've got people as high up in the council and local authorities who what it seems are turning a blind eye to this, in which they were. How can we actually ever stop this from occurring? And I see it from time and time again. Like Cambridgeshire, I've been trying to convince Cambridgeshire for rolling out some form of training course now for a very long time. And when I as part of my PhD, I had to speak to social workers and deliver my findings to them to get their reaction. And the social, to be fair, it's been really good response from social workers, and you know, I was quite worried actually when I had, I think, nearly 200 social workers on one sort of Eventbrite, sort of just it was like an information session rather than a training course, and it is quite daunting actually trying to actually present something to social workers where you might find they might push back against it, but by and large, very positive feedback, and they actually want to be part of the solution going forward. But yeah, these cases, there are certainly a lot more. So again, and I'm not going to ask you this now because I've sort of I've said about this, but you know, I was going to ask where in the world do you think a victim of child sex trafficking originates from, and according to the NRM stats, and this is from the Home Office via the National Crime Agency, is that 60% of them are actually from the UK. We do have some that are actually come from the continent and from America, but when I was asking social workers when I was interviewing them, there was all this sort of perception, and one of the most alarming things was that one of them had been in a training course that had actually given them contradictory information. What I actually found to understand was that they had a training course on human trafficking, and they were presenting the stats from adults rather than the stats that have been actually been put together for children. So it's again, it's given social workers the wrong information. I mean, everything you get on the internet is not factual, so we have to get it from you know, sources like the National Crime Agency. And don't get me wrong, statistics, we can use statistics in all different form of ways to actually manipulate something, but you know, this is 3 or 4 years robust of research. And then the NRM stats, I thought I'd share this towards the end here. As I said, the last 7-8 years, and we can see this trend going up. And as I said, in 2020, it plateaued. And we think that was an impact from COVID-19 and associated restrictions. And the National Crime Agency have actually made reference to that as well. And what I'm expecting for the figures in 2021 is to be much higher. And we can see this trend here as well. International victims actually caught up with the UK counterparts in 2020. So things are actually, I've been looking at the quarterly stats, and that's how I know this. There is going to be some form of the statistics will rise and perhaps even double. So yes, there's been missed opportunities. Local authorities throughout the UK are still failing to safeguard children and young people from child sex trafficking. For and this is to do with training, it's to do with awareness, it's to do with how social workers recognise, respond and report child sex trafficking. There's contradictions between the UK laws and the Child Protection Services policies and procedures. We're not taking the laws that are there to protect young people. We're not adapting policies. What the problem is that we have a Children's Act that is perhaps out of date, that is now like 15 years old, and it needs to evolve because things have evolved. And choice making is one of the big things as well. And I know I've only got a couple of minutes left here, but that's one of the things that quite alarming in some ways. I've worked with young people in the past, and some young people are very difficult to work with, and sometimes you will make a flippant comment to say that we can't do anything to help them. They will always do what they want to do, and to a degree, yes, that's right. We can't always control what a young person does, but some of the language, how these young people were portrayed in the inquiries in Rochdale and Rotherham, still exists today. So there is an attitude towards young people who get trafficked for sex, and like I said, why all these numerous factors. So any questions, anyone?